Riverside Plantation lay along a bend of the Mississippi River where the land sank low and wide, heavy with dark soil that held water after rain and baked hard under the sun. In summer the air rested thick over the fields, unmoving, as though pressed down by its own weight. The river smelled of mud and rot. The cotton plants grew in long, straight rows that seemed to have no end, their leaves dull with dust, their boles tearing open by late season to expose white fiber that cut the fingers when picked too fast. The work began before light. A bell rang while the sky still held its night color, and people rose from the quarters without speaking. The cabins were built of rough boards and clay, set close together, each one holding more bodies than it was meant to. Smoke drifted from chimneys where small fires were lit to boil cornmeal or warm leftovers from the night before. Children slept where they fell. Older women moved quietly so as not to wake them, though it made little difference. By sunrise, everyone would be awake. Rachel Moore rose at the same time every morning. She had done so since childhood, long enough that her body no longer resisted. Her joints ached, especially her knees and hands, but she did not pause to consider it. She tied her head wrap, smoothed her dress, and stepped outside. The ground was damp with dew. Insects hummed low in the grass. The sound of the bell faded, replaced by the shuffling of feet and the creak of wagon wheels being readied. She did not work the fields. She had not for many years. Her place was in the kitchen behind the main house, a long, low structure with a wide hearth and blackened walls. The fire there was kept alive through the night, banked with ash so that it could be brought back quickly at dawn. Rachel was often the first to reach it. She stirred the coals, laid fresh wood, and waited for the flames to take. The kitchen was separate from the house but close enough that orders traveled easily. It was expected to be quiet. The mistress disliked noise in the mornings. Rachel learned early to move without sound, to set down pots without clatter, to open doors slowly. Silence was a form of safety. It made one harder to notice. She prepared food that others would eat. Cornbread, salt pork, greens when they were in season, biscuits when flour was available, coffee for the house, watered down and boiled long. The smell of grease settled into her clothes and skin and did not leave. Her hands bore scars from years of burns and cuts. They moved steadily, without hurry, without pause. Nathaniel Pemberton owned Riverside Plantation. He had inherited it along with the people on it and expanded its acreage over the years. He was a large man, red-faced, with a voice that carried. He liked order. He liked to see work done on time and without complaint. He believed this meant he was a good master. His house rose above the yard on brick piers, 3 stories with white columns and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Inside, the floors were polished, the furniture heavy and dark. Rachel entered only to clean or to serve when called. She kept her eyes lowered. She had learned that looking directly at white people could be read as defiance, even when none was meant. There were 147 enslaved people on the plantation that year. The number was recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and tools. Names were listed, but they were not treated as names. They were marks of ownership. People came and went through sale or death. Children were born and added. The total shifted slightly each year. The fields were worked from first light until dusk. Men and women bent over the plants, sacks dragging behind them, hands moving quickly to meet the day's quota. Overseers rode along the rows on horseback, watching. Whips hung at their sides, used often enough that no one doubted their purpose. The sound of it carried across the fields when it fell. Work did not stop for it. Rachel heard these sounds from the kitchen yard. She did not turn her head. She had learned not to react. Reaction brought attention. Attention brought trouble. She was 42 years old that summer. Among the enslaved, this was considered old. Her hair had begun to gray beneath her head wrap. Her back stiffened when she stood too long. She was no longer assigned work that required speed or strength. Instead, she was valued for her knowledge of routine, for her reliability, for the way she followed instructions exactly. The mistress, Margaret Pemberton, was younger than her husband by many years. She had married into the plantation and was still learning its workings. She trusted Rachel without thinking about it. Trust was given easily when it was not considered dangerous. Rachel had been born on this land. She knew its edges, the low places where water pooled after rain, the stand of trees near the swamp where snakes hid in the heat. She knew the still room behind the kitchen, where herbs were hung to dry and jars lined the shelves. She knew which plants soothed and which burned. This knowledge had been passed quietly from one woman to another over generations. Her life followed a pattern that rarely changed. Wake before dawn, work through the day, return to the quarters at night, eat, sleep, repeat. Years passed in this way, marked only by seasons and losses. There had been one exception, a boy named Caleb. He was her younger brother, though she had raised him more than she had known him as a sibling. She had carried him when he was small, taught him when to be silent and when to speak, watched him grow tall and strong. He had learned quickly. Too quickly, some said. He had been taken into the blacksmith's shop as an apprentice. It was considered a good position. That had ended years ago, long enough that some spoke of it as a thing past, long enough that the plantation had absorbed the loss and moved on. Rachel had not. She did not speak of Caleb. Speaking did no good. It only reopened what could not be changed. Instead, she carried the memory with her into every task. It was present in the way she measured ingredients, in the care she took with knives and fire. It lived in the quiet moments when there was nothing to distract her. Those who watched her saw only a woman doing her work. They saw no grief, no anger. They took this as acceptance. The plantation ran on this assumption, that those held within it accepted their place, or at least had no choice but to endure it. It was a belief that made the system possible. The days stretched on, heat pressed down, cotton bloomed, was picked, was hauled away, bales were counted and shipped south to market, money changed hands, the ledgers were updated. Rachel moved through it all unseen. She listened when white men spoke, because they spoke as though she were not there. She noted habits, routines, small complaints uttered without care. She stored these things away without comment. At night, when the quarters settled and the sound of insects rose, she lay on her pallet and stared into the dark. She did not pray for deliverance. She did not dream of escape. Those were dangerous thoughts. Instead, she waited. Waiting had become her life. This was Riverside Plantation in the summer of 1858, a place of order and routine built on silence and force, a place where suffering was ordinary and unnoticed, a place where one woman worked in the kitchen, gray at the temples, hands scarred, eyes lowered, and was believed to be harmless. Nothing in her days suggested otherwise. The first sign did not come as a blow or a shout. It came quietly, as most things did on Riverside Plantation. It came as a change in tone, slight enough that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not learned to measure danger by the smallest shifts. In early March, while the nights were still cool and the days not yet heavy with heat, the overseer began riding the quarters later than usual. His name was Silas Crenshaw, and he had been on the plantation for several years by then. He was not young. His hair was thinning, his face lined from sun and drink, but he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew the power he held. He liked to be seen. He liked to remind people of his presence. Rachel noticed that he lingered near the blacksmith's shop more often. She noticed because Caleb worked there. She noticed because Crenshaw watched him longer than the others, his eyes following the boy's movements as he worked the bellows or lifted a hammer. There was no reason for it. The work was being done properly. The tools were kept in order. Still, the watching continued. Nothing was said at first. That was how it always began. Caleb came to the kitchen one evening to bring a broken hinge that needed mending. He set it down on the table and waited while Rachel finished stirring a pot. He stood straight, hands at his sides, as he had been taught. "They've been riding close," he said quietly, not looking at her. Rachel nodded once. She did not ask who, she already knew. "Don't talk back," she said. "Don't look up." "I don't," he said. She believed him. That did not ease her mind. The plantation had its rules, some written, most not. Enslaved people were expected to know them without being told. Breaking them brought punishment. Sometimes the rule itself was not clear until it was enforced. That uncertainty was part of its function. A pig went missing a few days later. It was not the first time livestock had disappeared from a plantation. Animals wandered. They were stolen by neighboring farmers. They died and were dragged off by scavengers. This was understood. But this pig was different. It belonged to Nathaniel Pemberton himself. It was large, well-fed, imported at expense. It had been shown off to visitors as proof of his success. When it did not appear at feeding time, the yard grew tense. Voices carried farther. Orders were given sharply. The overseer was summoned. The sheriff was sent for. Rachel was kneading dough when the sound of horses reached the kitchen yard. She did not stop her work. She did not need to look to know what was happening. She had heard this sound before, years earlier on other plantations. It meant a search. Men rode out across the fields and into the woods. Dogs were brought. Enslaved men were questioned, one by one. Answers were given carefully. Two quickly suggested guilt. Two slowly suggested the same. Caleb did not come to the kitchen that evening. Rachel waited until the fire burned low before asking where he was. The woman beside her shook her head once, eyes down. "They took him," she said. Rachel's hand stilled for a moment. Then she resumed their motion. Stopping would have been noticed. They found bones near the edge of the woods the next morning. Pig bones, scattered, gnawed. They found a knife as well. A skinning knife used for small game. It was Caleb's. He used it to trap rabbits and squirrels, meat that supplemented the ration when it could be spared. The knife lay where it had been placed. Rachel was not present when they dragged him from the shop. She heard about it later from mouths that spoke quickly and then closed. Chains, shouting, Caleb saying he had not done it, Crenshaw saying enough. By midday, it was decided that there would be a trial. Trials for enslaved people were not like trials for white men. They were brief. They were held to demonstrate order, not to discover truth. The outcome was rarely in doubt. Rachel was made to attend. All were. It was held in town in a room that smelled of wood and sweat. White men filled the benches. Enslaved people stood at the back. Caleb was brought in with his hands bound. His face was bruised. Rachel saw this and felt nothing move in her expression. She had learned how to hold her face still. The judge was Cornelius Blackwood, a man with a white beard and a voice practiced in command. He listened with half an ear as Crenshaw spoke. He nodded when the sheriff described the evidence. He did not look at Caleb when the boy tried to speak. No enslaved person was allowed to testify. That rule did not need statting. It was understood. The jury was made up of local men, property owners. They had eaten at Pemberton's table. They had traded with him. They understood what was expected. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. The sentence was read aloud. Death by hanging, to be carried out publicly in 3 days' time. There was a murmur in the room, satisfaction more than shock. The law had been upheld, property protected. Rachel watched each face as the words were spoken. She did not move. She did not cry out. She memorized. Outside, the sun was bright. The town went on with its business. People spoke of the hanging as something to attend, like a fair or a sermon. Rachel returned to the plantation that evening. She went back to the kitchen. She prepared supper. She served it. No one asked how she felt. She was not allowed to see Caleb before the execution. He was held in the jail. Others were not allowed near him. This was said to prevent unrest. It served another purpose as well. The day of the hanging was clear. The square filled early. Enslaved people were brought in wagons and made to stand together where they could see. White families gathered closer, some with children. The gallows stood in the center. Rachel stood among the others, her hands folded in front of her. She could see Caleb clearly. He looked smaller than she remembered. His shoulders were slumped. His mouth was set. The sheriff placed the rope around his neck. He did it carefully with a practiced hand. The judge read the sentence again. His voice carried. When the trapdoor fell, the rope did not break Caleb's neck. His body dropped and caught. His legs kicked. His hands strained against their bonds. Time passed. People watched, some laughed, some turned away. No one intervened. Rachel counted her breaths. She did not look away. When it was over, the body was left hanging. This was done on purpose, a warning. Later it was cut down and taken away. There was no coffin, no marker. Rachel was forbidden to mourn. She returned to work. From that day on, something settled over the plantation. It was not relief. It was fear, quiet and contained. People spoke less. They watched more closely. They understood that innocence offered no protection. Rachel worked as she always had. She rose before dawn. She prepared food. She followed orders. Those who watched her saw nothing out of the ordinary. But beneath the routine, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, not with noise but with finality. The authority that governed Riverside Plantation had shown itself plainly. It had taken a life and expected silence in return. Rachel gave it. And she remembered everything. After the hanging, the plantation did not change in any visible way. The bell still rang before dawn. The fields were worked. Meals were prepared and eaten. Orders were given and obeyed. If an outsider had arrived in the weeks that followed, he would have seen nothing unusual. Riverside continued as it always had. For those who lived there, the change was quieter and more complete. The overseer rode more often. His visits were less predictable. Sometimes he came before sunrise when people were still pulling on their clothes. Sometimes he came late when backs were already bent and hands raw from picking. The whip was used more freely, not always for failing to meet quotas, sometimes for looking up, sometimes for speaking without permission, sometimes for nothing that could be named. The drivers were instructed to report any sign of discontent. This was said plainly in front of the quarters. No one asked what would count as discontent. They already knew. Rachel noticed that men stopped speaking in the evenings. Where there had once been low talk after dark, there was now mostly silence. People ate and lay down. Children were hushed more sharply. Mothers pulled them close, not out of tenderness but caution. The name Caleb was not spoken. Rachel did not expect it to be. Names of the dead carried danger. Remembering was done inwardly. She continued her work in the kitchen. She measured flour, salted meat, boiled greens. She scrubbed pots until her hands ached. The routine gave her cover. It allowed her to think without appearing idle. She watched the way authority moved through the plantation. She watched who was given orders and who gave them. She noted which men lingered in the yard, which avoided it. She listened when white men spoke in her presence because they spoke freely, believing she did not understand or did not matter. Nathaniel Pemberton spoke often of order. He said it at the table to visitors, to his wife. He said the hanging had been necessary. He said examples must be made. He said this was how things had always been done. Rachel served him food while he spoke. She kept her eyes down. She refilled his cup when it was empty. The sheriff came to the plantation once more that spring. He rode up in the afternoon, his horse lathered, his boots muddy. He spoke with Pemberton on the porch. Rachel heard his voice through the open door as she worked. He laughed when he spoke of the execution, as though it were a story worth repeating. The judge did not come. He did not need to. His work had been done. The pressure settled into the days like humidity. It made every movement slower, heavier. People grew careful in ways that could not be explained to those who had never lived under such conditions. They learned to read faces, to sense moods before they were expressed. Survival depended on it. Rachel was no exception. She had learned these skills long ago. What changed was how she used them. She began to notice patterns. She noticed when Pemberton drank more heavily and when he abstained. She noticed which foods he favored and which he pushed aside. She noticed the medicines kept in the still room, the tonics prescribed by the doctor, the way they were prepared and administered. She noticed that the overseer avoided certain areas of the property. He did not ride near the swamp if he could help it. He did not dismount there. This was spoken of quietly among the enslaved, half in jest, half in fear. She noticed who traveled into town and who returned with news. Information moved along paths that white men rarely saw. It passed from field to kitchen, from stable to yard, carried in fragments and hints. Rachel did not ask questions openly. She listened. The workdays lengthened as summer approached. The sun rose earlier and set later. Quotas were increased. The pace quickened. Mistakes were punished. One afternoon, a boy no older than 12 dropped his sack while picking. Cotton spilled onto the ground. The overseer saw it and rode over. The whipping was administered there in front of the others. The boy cried out until he could not. Rachel heard it from the kitchen yard. She did not look. She stirred the pot. Her face remained still. That night she lay awake longer than usual. The quarters were quiet. Even the insects seemed subdued. She listened to the sound of breathing around her, the small noises of sleep. She did not think of escape. That path had been closed to her long ago. She did not think of open defiance. She had seen where that led. Instead, she thought of time. Time was the one thing the plantation could not control completely. It could be structured, measured, enforced, but it still passed. Days became weeks. Weeks became years. People aged. Bodies weakened. Circumstances shifted. She had learned patience as a child. It had been taught to her by necessity. Waiting was a skill like any other. It required discipline. The pressure increased as summer deepened. A new overseer was spoken of, though Crenshaw remained for the time being. The doctor visited more often. Sickness spread among the quarters. Fevers took some. Others recovered slowly. Rachel tended the sick when she could. She brewed teas from herbs she knew. She did not draw attention to this knowledge. It was expected that older women would know such things. She also learned from the doctor when he spoke freely in the kitchen, explaining treatments as though instructing a child. She listened carefully. She remembered. The plantation's power rested on certainty. The certainty that rules would be enforced. The certainty that punishment would follow disobedience. The certainty that those held in bondage had no recourse. Rachel understood this. She had lived under it her entire life. What she also understood, slowly and with care, was that certainty depended on blindness. It depended on not seeing what was directly in front of it. It depended on assumptions. She did nothing to challenge those assumptions. She reinforced them. She worked harder. She spoke less. She complied without hesitation. She became what they expected her to be. Inside, the pressure did not crush her. It compressed her resolve, shaping it into something narrower and stronger. The plantation moved toward harvest. The fields filled with white fiber. Wagons creaked under their loads. The river carried the bales away. Rachel moved with the season. She waited. The system believed it had restored order. It believed the lesson had been learned. It did not know that something irreversible had already begun, quietly, beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing day. The line was not crossed with spectacle. It was crossed without announcement, in a room that smelled of damp wood and boiled herbs, on a morning that began like any other. There was no single moment that anyone could later point to and say this was when it changed. That was the nature of such things. The most lasting acts were often the least visible. Late July brought with it a sickness that settled into the plantation like a fog. It was called by different names depending on who spoke of it: lung fever, summer ague, a seasonal complaint brought on by heat and damp air. Men complained of tightness in the chest. Women coughed through the night. The doctor came more often. riding up in the afternoons with his leather bag and his practiced confidence. Nathaniel Pemberton fell ill near the end of the month. At first it was spoken of lightly. He had been drinking too much. He had spent too many hours in the sun. He would rest for a few days and be well. He had always recovered before. Rachel learned of it when she was told to prepare a special broth for the house. Light food, nothing heavy. The doctor's instructions were repeated to her as though she were a vessel rather than a person. She listened without comment. The doctor prescribed a tonic, whiskey, honey, lemon, and a handful of dried herbs. It was to be taken morning, midday, and evening. The still room was unlocked for the purpose. Rachel was given the task of preparing it. She did not hesitate. She did not ask questions. She took the list of ingredients and nodded once. The still room was cool even in summer. Jars lined the shelves, their contents labeled in a careful hand. Some were for cooking, some for medicine. Some had been there longer than anyone could remember. The smell was sharp and green, with an undercurrent of rot. Rachel prepared the tonic exactly as instructed. She measured carefully. She stirred slowly. She poured it into a bottle identical to the one beside it. She prepared a second bottle as well. This was the moment when the line was crossed, though no one present could have named it as such. There was no outward sign, no tremor in her hands, no change in her expression. The act itself was small, precise, and deliberate. She returned the bottles to the shelf. She locked the door. For 3 days the tonic was given as prescribed. Pemberton's cough eased slightly. This was noted with satisfaction. The doctor nodded when told. He said the medicine was working. On the 4th day, Rachel substituted the bottle. Nothing happened at once. That was the point. The work of the plantation continued. Orders were given from Pemberton's bed. Visitors were turned away. Margaret Pemberton sat beside her husband and dabbed his forehead with a cloth. She thanked Rachel for her care. Rachel accepted the thanks and returned to the kitchen. As the days passed, Pemberton's condition worsened. His breathing grew labored. His hands trembled. He complained of pain in his chest that did not ease with rest. The doctor frowned and adjusted the treatment. He ordered bloodletting. He ordered leeches. He ordered more tonic. Rachel complied. At the same time, another change was taking place. Silas Crenshaw began his inspections of the gin house earlier before full light. The harvest was approaching. Machines needed to be checked. Belts tightened. Nothing could be allowed to fail. The gin house sat apart from the other buildings, near ground that stayed wet year-round. It was a place most avoided when they could. Snakes were common there. This was known. It was spoken of with the same resignation that accompanied all dangers on the plantation. Rachel began rising earlier than usual. She left the quarters before the bell, moving through the dim light toward the edge of the property. She carried a sack and a forked stick. No one questioned her absence. Older women were granted a certain freedom of movement, provided they did not abuse it. She worked quietly, patiently. She knew where to look. She had learned this knowledge long before she knew she would need it. The swamp gave up its inhabitants reluctantly. She accepted this and waited. By the end of the week, she had what she needed. The plantation slept on the night she chose. The air was still. The stars were faint behind thin cloud. Rachel moved as she always had, without sound. She carried the weight with care. Inside the gin house, she worked slowly. She placed things where they would not be seen at a glance. She scattered debris where it would not be questioned. When she was finished, she stood for a moment in the dark, listening to her own breathing. Then she left. Morning came. Crenshaw entered the gin house as he had every morning that week. He carried a lantern. He walked the same path. He did not see what lay in his way until it was too late. The screams carried across the fields. People ran. They found him staggering, his face already swelling, his voice breaking into incoherent cries. The lantern lay shattered on the floor behind him. Something moved in the shadows. The doctor was sent for. It did no good. By midday, Silas Crenshaw was dead. The plantation reeled, but only briefly. Death was not unfamiliar. It was explained quickly and satisfactorily. Snakes were common. Accidents happened. The overseer had been careless. Production could not stop. Rachel stood in the kitchen when the news reached her. She did not ask how it had happened. She did not need to. She murmured the expected words. She resumed her work. Pemberton's condition continued to decline. His legs swelled. His skin grew pale. He could no longer leave his bed. The doctor confessed his confusion to Margaret in the hall, his voice low but not low enough. Rachel heard. The night Pemberton died was quiet. There was no struggle. Margaret slept beside him and did not wake until morning. When she did, she called out once sharply. The house stirred. The doctor was summoned. He examined the body and shook his head. Heart failure, he said. Complications of lung fever. It was unfortunate but not unexpected. The death was recorded. Notices were sent. A funeral was arranged. Rachel attended with the other house servants. She stood at the back and watched the coffin lowered into the ground. She listened to the words spoken over it. They meant nothing to her. 2 men were dead. No one connected the deaths. There was no reason to. One had been an accident, the other an illness. The plantation mourned briefly and then turned its attention to the practical matters that followed. Margaret Pemberton inherited Riverside Plantation. She was unprepared for the responsibility. Decisions were delayed. Confusion spread. A new overseer was hired from outside the county. He arrived with his own habits and expectations. In the midst of this, Rachel continued her work. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. What had been imagined had become real. The consequences were irreversible. Rachel did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief. What she felt was a narrowing of purpose. The waiting had ended. The work had begun. She washed her hands and prepared the evening meal. After the funerals, the plantation settled into a different rhythm. It was not calmer. It was uncertain. Uncertainty carried its own weight, pressing down on every decision, every delay. Authority did not disappear, but it lost some of its sharpness. Orders were given and then reconsidered. Instructions contradicted one another. The new overseer, Duncan, walked the fields with a careful eye, learning ground that was not his, watching people who did not yet know him well enough to fear him properly. Rachel observed all of this without comment. She had lived long enough to understand that confusion created spaces where certainty once ruled. Those spaces were narrow and temporary, but they existed. They could be used. Her work did not change outwardly. She remained in the kitchen and the still room, rising before dawn, preparing meals, cleaning, preserving. The mistress leaned on her more heavily now, grateful for steadiness in a household that had lost its center. Rachel accepted the additional tasks without complaint. She was given more access than before, not because she was trusted as a person, but because she was trusted as a function. She did not confuse the two. The still room became her refuge. It was a place where time slowed, where hands worked and mind followed. She cataloged what she had learned over the years, not in writing but in memory, which plants grew where, which dried leaves kept their strength longest, which tinctures changed taste when heated and which did not. This knowledge was not new. What was new was its purpose. She began keeping track of people again, more deliberately now. Not everyone, only those whose names she already carried. She listened for mention of them. She noted where they were said to be, how often they traveled, what ailments they complained of. This required patience. Information came slowly and often indirectly. Sheriff Tobias Winthrop's name came up first. It was spoken by men who went into town on errands and returned with news they did not realize was valuable. They spoke of him drinking heavily, of him being ill, of him complaining about rats in his rooms. Rachel did not react. She stored it away. She did not hurry. Haste was dangerous. The plantation doctor continued to visit regularly, checking on Margaret Pemberton's nerves and the health of the household. He spoke freely in Rachel's presence, explaining his methods as though to a child. He believed this demonstrated his benevolence. Rachel listened. She learned how symptoms were interpreted, how long an illness had to last before it raised suspicion, what was considered common and what was considered strange. She learned what doctors expected to see, and therefore what they were likely to overlook. At night she slept lightly, not from fear of discovery but from habit. Her body was accustomed to wakefulness. In the hours before dawn she sometimes thought of Caleb, not as he had died but as he had been, working at the forge, laughing quietly at something only he understood. She allowed herself these memories now. They no longer threatened to undo her. The work continued. News came from town in fragments. The sheriff had grown worse. He had been bedridden. The doctor believed it was cholera or something like it. This was accepted. The river brought sickness. Everyone knew that. Rachel prepared preserves in the kitchen one afternoon under Margaret Pemberton's supervision. The mistress had taken up the task as a diversion, something to occupy her thoughts. Jars were lined up, filled, sealed. Rachel followed instructions exactly. One jar was different, only she knew it. When the basket was sent into town as a gift, Rachel packed it carefully. She spoke when necessary. She made sure the right words were heard by the right person. She did not linger. Days passed. Sheriff Winthrop died. The news reached the plantation by way of the wagon driver. He spoke of it casually as though mentioning the weather. Cholera, he said. A bad case. The sheriff had wasted away quickly. They had buried him fast. Rachel nodded once and continued cutting vegetables. 3 men were dead now. No one remarked on the number. No one drew a line between the events. Each death belonged to its own explanation. Accident, illness, misfortune. The world provided many ways for men to die. The judge's name came next, spoken more softly. Cornelius Blackwood had been unwell for some time. His heart was weak. This was known. When he died suddenly in his home, there was surprise but not disbelief. Rachel learned of it days later. She allowed herself a moment of stillness in the still room, alone among the jars. She closed her eyes. She did not smile. 4. The remaining names were more distant. They lived on other plantations. They traveled. They were not as easily reached. This did not trouble her. Distance had never discouraged her. It only required adjustment. She made small preparations, nothing that would draw notice. A little more of this plant dried, a little less of that one used. Everything remained within the bounds of ordinary kitchen work. She did not speak of what she was doing to anyone who did not need to know. Silence was essential. Silence had always been essential. The enslaved community on Riverside Plantation continued its own quiet resistance. People shared food when they could. They warned one another of danger. They remembered the dead even when they could not speak their names. These acts were small. They were also necessary. Rachel's resistance took a different form. It did not involve running or striking or shouting. It involved watching and waiting and acting only when the moment allowed no retreat. She knew that what she was doing could not change the system. Slavery would not fall because of her actions. She did not pretend otherwise. This was not about reform or redemption. It was about memory and consequence. The law had failed her brother. The plantation had demanded silence. She had given it, but silence did not mean forgetting. It did not mean forgiveness. As summer gave way to early fall, the air cooled slightly. The cotton harvest neared its end. The fields thinned. Wagons rolled more frequently toward the river. Rachel continued to work. Those who saw her saw only a woman doing what she had always done. They did not see the careful accounting taking place beneath the surface. They did not see the balance being restored, one name at a time. Quiet resistance did not announce itself. It left no banners. It did not seek witnesses. It moved forward, patient and exact, carried by a woman who had learned long ago that survival required more than endurance. It required memory. And memory, once acted upon, became something else entirely. By early autumn the pattern existed, though no one named it. Men of standing in Adams County had died within a short span of time, and the explanations offered for each death were accepted without resistance. Illness, accident, weak heart, excess drink. These causes required no further inquiry. They fit within the expectations of the world as it understood itself. Institutions did not fail loudly. They failed by refusing to look. The county court recorded the deaths as they came, each entry written in a careful hand, each one isolated from the others. There was no column for coincidence, no space for doubt. The clerk copied the doctor's statements and closed the books. The plantation followed suit. Riverside Plantation had lost its owner and its overseer within weeks of one another. This should have raised questions. Instead, it produced only inconvenience. Margaret Pemberton struggled with the accounts. The new overseer focused on maintaining output. Cotton prices were discussed. Labor was redistributed. The dead were absorbed into the past. Rachel watched this process with the same attention she gave to her work. She did not expect investigation. She understood the limits of white curiosity when it turned inward. The system was designed to examine enslaved people closely and white men not at all. When whispers did arise, they were redirected quickly. Some spoke of bad luck, others of God's will. A few mentioned the unhealthy summer. These explanations satisfied because they required no action. The judge's death had unsettled some. Cornelius Blackwood had been a figure of authority for decades. His passing marked the end of an era, or so the papers said. Editorials praised his service. None mentioned the cases he had presided over. None spoke of the lives he had ended with a word. Rachel heard these praises repeated by white men who came through the plantation on business. She poured coffee while they spoke. She listened to their recollections. They spoke of Blackwood as a man of law and order, firm but fair. She did not interrupt. The remaining jury members were spoken of less publicly. Their deaths, when they came, were folded into private grief. Families mourned. Estates were settled. Property changed hands. Each event was contained within its own boundaries. When Josiah Pembroke began to fail, his family called it age. His trembling hands, his confusion, his sudden suspicions were treated as the natural decline of a man who had lived long and hard. His doctor adjusted his diet and prescribed rest. He did not consider poison. That thought did not belong in his world. Pembroke's death was pitied but not examined. A man had lost his mind, then his life. It was unfortunate. It was also unremarkable. Rachel learned of it days later. She noted the date. She did not mark it outwardly. By this point, 5 men were gone. Still, no one asked why. The denial was not passive. It was maintained. Questions that edged too close were dismissed. A visiting merchant remarked on the number of funerals that season and was met with a sharp look. He did not press the matter. Pressing such matters invited discomfort, and discomfort was avoided whenever possible. The sheriff's office appointed a replacement. The judge's seat was filled. Overseers were hired. The machinery of authority continued to turn, adjusted slightly but intact. Individuals were replaceable. The structure remained. Rachel understood this well. It was why she did not mistake her actions for victory. This was not justice in the sense the law recognized. It was accounting. Albert Cunningham's absence was explained differently. He had been found dead outside town, his body battered. The official word was a riding accident. He had been known to drink. Horses were unpredictable. No further explanation was required. There were rumors, of course. There always were. Some spoke of robbery, others of a fall. A few hinted at darker possibilities. These whispers did not travel far. Cunningham's reputation ensured that sympathy was limited. His business associates settled his accounts and moved on. Rachel heard of his death from a woman who had once belonged to him and no longer did. The woman spoke quietly, her voice flat. Rachel did not respond. There were no words that would improve the moment. Zigzag. Walter Simmons remained. He was spoken of as being in New Orleans. He had business there. He would return when it suited him. Rachel waited. In the meantime, the plantation continued its routines. The fields emptied as the harvest ended. Repairs were made. Winter stores were laid in. The kitchen smelled of preserved fruit and smoked meat. Rachel remained invisible. The institutions that governed her life did not see her. They did not imagine her capable of sustained thought beyond her immediate tasks. This belief was not questioned. It did not need to be defended. It was simply assumed. This assumption protected her more effectively than any hiding place. When Simmons finally returned to Natchez, his arrival was noted only in passing. He was known to drink heavily. He was known to gamble. He was known to overindulge. These habits explained much. His death in a tavern was attributed to excess. Apoplexy, the doctor said, a seizure. Drink had weakened him. No one suggested poison. No one asked who had poured the glass. The tavern was cleaned. Business resumed. 7 men were dead. The record books showed nothing unusual. The plantation ledgers were balanced. The court docket moved forward. Authority reasserted itself, confident in its explanations. Rachel stood in the kitchen when she heard the final news. She was cutting bread. Her hands moved steadily. She did not pause. Institutional denial was complete. The system had examined itself and found no fault. It had closed its eyes to the connections that might have undone it. It had done what it was designed to do, protect itself. Rachel washed her hands and set the table. What she had done existed outside the law, outside the record, outside the explanations that satisfied those in power. It would remain there, unseen and unacknowledged. That too was by design. She did not expect recognition. She did not seek absolution. What mattered had already been done. The institutions would never admit it. They would never speak her name. They would never understand how close they had come to seeing the truth. Rachel did not require their understanding. She required only that the memory she carried had been answered, and that the silence demanded of her had finally been put to use. The truth did not arrive with force. It did not break through doors or announce itself in the street. It surfaced slowly, in fragments, shaped by time and distance, and by people who no longer feared the consequences of speaking. In the months after the last death, Adams County settled into a wary calm. The season turned. Leaves fell from the trees along the river. The air cooled, then sharpened. Cotton accounts were closed. New contracts were written. Men adjusted to the absence of those who had once held authority, and others stepped into the spaces they left behind. Riverside Plantation endured. It was leaner, less certain, but it remained. Margaret Pemberton relied increasingly on hired managers and lawyers. She spoke often of her late husband, less as a person than as a figure whose presence might still anchor her decisions. The enslaved people continued their labor under altered supervision, but the structure remained familiar. Rachel remained where she had always been. Nothing in her daily conduct suggested that anything had changed. She did not grow careless. She did not grow bold. If anything, she withdrew further into routine. She spoke less than before. She avoided attention. Those who watched her saw only age and fatigue. But beyond the plantation, time was beginning its work. In Natchez, men spoke in quieter tones about the year that had passed. It was not uncommon for several prominent men to die in a season, but the clustering lingered in memory. Some dismissed it as chance. Others muttered about curses, about the river air, about punishment sent by God. These conversations were not serious. They did not result in inquiry. Still, they existed. Among the enslaved, memory moved differently. Stories were not told openly. They were shared in pieces late at night or while walking from one place to another. A name mentioned here, a glance exchanged there. No one spoke the whole thing aloud. That would have been dangerous, but understanding did not require completeness. Rachel did not correct anyone. She did not confirm or deny. She allowed what was known to remain uncertain. Certainty could be traced. Ambiguity could not. The war came slowly at first, then all at once. Talk of secession had filled white parlors for years, dismissed and revived with equal ease. When it finally became action, it did not seem real even then. Men marched off with confidence. Flags were raised. Speeches were made. Riverside Plantation sent its sons and its overseers to fight for a cause they believed would protect their way of life. The absence of those men altered the plantation more than any death had. Control loosened. Patrols became irregular. News from the outside came less filtered. Rumors traveled faster. Rachel listened. Union troops reached Natchez before they reached Riverside. The town changed hands without a major battle. Soldiers occupied buildings. Authority shifted abruptly. Laws that had once seemed permanent were suspended or ignored. Enslaved people fled plantations and gathered behind Union lines, drawn by the promise of protection, however uncertain. Rachel waited until the opportunity was clear. She left Riverside Plantation with nothing but what she could carry. She did not look back. She did not announce her departure. She walked toward the sound of the river and the distant presence of soldiers who did not claim ownership over her body. In the contraband camps, she found a different kind of hardship: crowded tents, illness, hunger, confusion. Freedom, when it came, did not come cleanly. It came with demands and uncertainty and new forms of control. Still, it was not bondage. Rachel took work where it was offered: cooking, washing, tending to the sick. These tasks were familiar. They gave her a place. It was there that she met a chaplain, a man who moved among the camps collecting accounts of life under slavery. He asked questions carefully. He listened more than he spoke. He wrote things down. Rachel did not speak to him at first. She had learned that silence was safer than truth. It was only after months had passed, after the war had shifted again, after the certainty of change seemed more secure, that she agreed to talk. They sat apart from the others, near a fire that burned low. She spoke quietly. She did not embellish. She did not justify. She told him about her brother. She told him about the trial and the hanging. She told him the names of the men involved. She told him what had happened to them. The chaplain listened without interruption. When she finished, he asked her how she felt about it. Rachel considered the question. It had been many years since anyone had asked her how she felt. She told him the truth, that she felt nothing resembling regret, that she felt only that a debt had been answered, that she did not believe the law had ever intended to protect her or her brother, and therefore she had not felt bound by it. The chaplain wrote carefully. He changed names. He altered places. He did not do this to obscure the truth, but to preserve it. Even with slavery collapsing, danger remained. He understood that. Rachel did not ask what would become of her words. She did not need to know. Speaking had not been about recognition. It had been about release. After the war, she returned to Natchez. The town was altered but familiar. Buildings still stood. Streets still ran where they always had. Power had shifted but not vanished. Rachel found work as a laundress. It was hard labor, but it paid. She lived in a small house with other women. She attended a church where former enslaved people gathered and spoke freely for the first time. She learned that freedom did not erase memory. It simply gave memory room to breathe. Her story did not circulate widely. It was not meant to. It existed in records few would read, and in recollections passed quietly between those who understood what it meant. Truth had surfaced, but only partially, and only where it could survive. Rachel lived the rest of her life without spectacle. She taught children to read when she could. She worked. She aged. She died without ceremony. The men who had died before the war were remembered differently. Some were praised. Some were forgotten. Their ends were folded into history without explanation. Rachel's truth remained at the margins, where so many truths from that era lived. It did not need vindication. It did not seek judgment. It existed, finally, outside the silence that had once been imposed on it, and that was enough. The aftermath did not announce itself with change. It arrived as continuation. Rachel Moore lived into the years after the war without ceremony and without notice beyond a narrow circle. Freedom, when it came, did not undo the body. Her hands remained stiff. Her breathing grew shallow in cold weather. Illness visited more often than it had when she was younger, lingering longer each time. She did not complain. Complaint had never altered circumstances. She rented a small room in Natchez, close enough to the river that dampness settled into the walls. She worked as a laundress for white families who now spoke differently but behaved much the same. They paid her wages. They did not ask her history. She did not offer it. Reconstruction moved through the town in uneven steps. Soldiers came and went. New laws were posted. Some were enforced. Many were not. Black men voted for a time, then found ways barred again. Violence returned in forms that were less formal but no less effective. The names of groups changed. The purpose did not. Rachel watched this without surprise. She attended church regularly. It was a place where voices were raised, where memory could be shared without fear of immediate punishment. Even there, she spoke little. She listened to others recount losses, separations, years stolen. Her story did not require repetition. It had already been lived. Children gathered in the evenings for lessons. Reading was taught slowly, carefully. Rachel helped when she could. She sat with the youngest, guiding their hands over letters. She did not tell them why reading mattered. She showed them. When she thought of Caleb now, it was without the sharpness that had once defined every waking moment. His face came to her in fragments, the sound of his voice, the way he had held tools, confident and precise. She did not dwell on his death. That part had been addressed in the only way available to her at the time. She did not believe what she had done had corrected the world. She was not confused on that point. The plantation system had fallen, but the structure beneath it remained. Power still concentrated itself. Law still served some better than others. The difference was not in kind, but in form. Rachel's life after bondage was modest and contained. She did not travel. She did not seek recognition. She did not tell her story to those who would turn it into something else. She understood how easily truth could be reshaped once it left the mouth. She died in the early 70s after a winter illness from which she did not recover. Tuberculosis was written on the paper. It was a common enough cause. There was no inquest, no notice in the papers. She was buried in a small plot with others like her, the ground marked simply, if at all. What remained of her passed quietly into record and rumor. Years later, a chaplain's papers were catalogued. Names were redacted, details blurred. A story was noted and set aside as possibly exaggerated. County records confirmed deaths. Plantation logs listed a kitchen woman of the right age, present at the right time. No conclusion was drawn. Historians would later argue about likelihoods, about motive, about plausibility. Some would say it was coincidence. Others would say it was resistance. None would be able to say with certainty. Rachel would not have been troubled by this. She had never acted for history. She had acted for memory. Caleb's grave remained unmarked. The land around it changed hands. Trees grew and were cut down. Roads shifted. His name did not appear in textbooks. It survived only where someone chose to remember it. Rachel had chosen. The men who had condemned him were gone before the war erased their authority. Their deaths did not alter the course of the nation. They altered one life. That had been enough. The aftermath of Rachel Moore's actions was not redemption or peace. It was endurance. It was the quiet continuation of a woman who had been forced to wait, who had waited, and who had answered injustice in the only manner left open to her. There was no celebration at the end of her story, no moral resolution offered to ease the weight of what had been done or what had been suffered. There was only the record of a life shaped by power and silence, and of a reckoning carried out beyond the reach of the law. That reckoning did not ask to be approved. It asked only to be remembered.